So there has been a wave of criticism and negativity towards Diablo 4 over the past, well, since season 1 really launched, and even before that when they launched their first season 1 patch. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I agree with a lot of the reasons, but there has been a lot of the game that I've experienced. I've gotten multiple characters to level 100. I played the game before it was even released with the content creator, kind of build that they had, as well as I've just been playing the game a ton. And I don't agree with everyone when they say Diablo 4 in its entirety is a trash game. There is a large portion of the game that's actually extremely fun, and I'm going to kind of talk through all of that. Some points that I think at this point we are really needing fixed, and has just really downtrended the game at this point. And some of the things that they've actually done really well, and I wish they had done more so of. Though, let's start off with the early game. And ironically, to most ARPGs, this is, or contrary to most ARPGs, this is the best part of the game. Going into World Tier 2, World Tier 1, running around the map and doing a lot of the campaign or doing a lot of the side quests or dungeons and just enjoying the initial experience, which the level 50 process for the average player might take around 50-60 hours or so, just I guess say casually going through the game. It really is a long experience for the majority of people, and in fact this is about all of the gameplay that most people will get out of if you're a casual player. And I think they've actually done the early game quite well. There are still some campaign quests that are absolute memes, like the camel walking quest. And there are still some things like barriers around the map, or the fact that, well, I guess some people don't like the fact that you have to wait to get your horse. Or maybe even if you wanted to talk about, your random renown gaining. These things do happen. But to be honest, if you're just looking at this from a campaign experience in the early game and not considering the repeat of all the seasons and all that type of stuff, it actually has a really, really good gameplay loop, about 60 to 70 hours, because during that time, you really feel like you're progressing your character, getting gear constantly, and really just, I guess you'd say, getting a lot of good upgrading feeling, which is kind of the whole point of ARPGs. There isn't really a point in this early game process that I've had, I guess you say, a problem with it, for me personally. This is the most enjoyable part of the game, and this is what most people experience. So when people say, oh, the game is trash, and all these reviews, or even like myself who have said that there's a lot of problems with the game, this doesn't really crop up in the early game. The only exception to this would be some of the quality of life, things like stash space potentially. But for the most part, the repetitive nature of ARPGs doesn't really settle in at this point. So to be honest, this early game portion, I would give the game a 7 or an 8 out of 10 because of how fun this early game and how, I guess you say, clean the early game feels, because really you're just experiencing the normal combat of the game and a lot of the things that the game has to offer for the first time. And I might add that I thought the campaign was actually quite good as well. That really has a personal opinion attached to it though, as does everything in this video, but in particular campaign is whether you like it or not, just straight off. So I really, really enjoyed the early game, and I don't think that's what the problem with this game actually has, or rather the problem that people mentioned doesn't really have anything to do with the early game most of the time. As we dive into the mid game, this is where the cracks in the armors really start to show, so to say. And what I mean by that is, for the most part, the mid game is actually a very fun experience, similar to the early game process. You have to remember that when we're judging these, they usually use numbers that are casual based. Obviously, you can get to level 100 in like 40 hours or whatever it is, right? But for the mid game, it usually takes another 50 to 60 hours to go from that world tier 3, that point when you hit level 50, you could jump into world tier 3 and you start diving into world tier 4 as well, which is roughly level 70 for most people. This is actually a very fun portion of the game as well. So when you get to this point, you're finally starting to actually build out your character, right? You get access to your uniques, which can really define classes like the Druid. You get access to the Paragon board, which once again gives you massive power boosts and you feel extremely strong when you unlock certain nodes. Then there's also the fact that, well, you're going to actually start looking at your gear and deciding which ones to keep and which ones to not due to the sacreds that you start to drop, right? Because sacreds are going to be upgrades basically every single time when you first reach this, and eventually when you reach ancestrals as well. There's still a couple of problems, like as I mentioned, the quality of life really starts to seep in at this point. And also, one thing that's really going to be something that you basically will have to know for the rest of the game is that nightmare dungeons are your only piece of content. The problem with once you reach World Tier 3 is everything in the open world starts to become basically useless at certain levels. So once you reach level 56 and once you reach level 76 in World Tier 3 and World Tier 4 respectively, the open world basically gives you no experience because now you are out leveling them and you get reduced experience. So if you want to do anything in open world, well, you're not getting rewarded for it. So now it starts to feel kind of bad to do these two pieces of content. And in World Tier 4, it's even more so because, well, you don't get any buff again, right? Remainder is up to level 100. So you're going to be kind of stuck and basically get excluded from any open world content. So if you wanted a renown grind, if you wanted to do anything like that, you should be doing that before you reach these levels. The exception would be Helltide zones, as I'm in right now, but for the most part, open world is completely worthless. And the biggest thing is, as I mentioned, because of this, open world being useless, nightmare dungeons are basically the remainder of content that you'll get in the entirety of the rest of the game. So the remainder of time that you spend in the game is going to be spent in nightmare dungeons. And for most people, well, they kind of expected that in ARPGs, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's something that people enjoy. There are a few annoying aspects of the Nightmare Dungeon system. It's not like you can just run in and repeat the same dungeon, which is actually what most people do in ARPGs. It's kind of a little bit more of a, I guess you'd say, annoying process to try to grind up to certain ones that you want to do. And, well, that kind of leads us into the end game. So the end game, this is where the vast majority of criticisms and complaints and feedback comes from, because the biggest players of the game oftentimes have the loudest voices, and they're oftentimes in the end game, right? Including myself. Now, there's a few things about the end game and where it starts. Usually it starts, in my opinion, around level 80 to 90 when you have your build online. And the remainder of the game is min-maxing your gear, finishing off your Paragon glyph levels, and your Paragon, of course, reaching level 100, and doing Nightmare Dungeons, potentially reaching tier 100. Lilith, the Uber boss, is kind of in that endgame content, but it's not really a repeatable content. It's like a one and done type thing. So I guess you could look at that how you want. But the first thing is Nightmare Dungeons. As I already mentioned, Nightmare Dungeons are kind of like a more unfun version of a lot of other repetitive content in other games, at least in my opinion. Before, when you had to travel to each Nightmare Dungeon, and it kind of gave you this sense of like world, and you had to use the open world to traverse and all this different stuff, well, you could consider that worse or better depending on how you look at it. But because they've taken that away, you don't get that feeling anymore, right? And to me, that is less enjoyable. Even though you get more XP per hour, which is kind of more rewarding, well, running around to each Nightmare Dungeon has kind of limited the, I guess you say, enjoyment of anything else inside the game. You know, randomly completing various things around the map or doing events if that's something you wish to do. Again, not everyone wishes to do it. And I'm not saying that the teleport to Nightmare Dungeons is bad, but the way they've designed the game was around the fact that you had to traverse the map, right? And the fact that they basically removed that in conjunction with making open world useless, as I mentioned earlier, well, you kind of literally just have Nightmare Dungeons. And to teleport to each of these different ones, but also to kind of have to deal with these negative affixes that are completely random, and then seeing yourself basically scrap 90% of your sigils, having the entire sigil sorting process, and then having to do subpar dungeons, knowing that they're worse XP or worse loot, is just not a fun experience for me and most people. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the itemization slash loot grind in of itself, right? In most other ARPGs, you drop a legendary and you're like, okay, that is going to be my upgrade. You play Diablo 3, you drop a legendary, you know that's going to potentially be an upgrade. You drop a rare, you know it's trash, right? And the way Diablo 4's itemization works is kind of the opposite in a sense. Legendaries could still be big upgrades, But uniques are oftentimes just trash for most builds because they don't give you the stats that you need. So those aren't really exciting to acquire. And the legendaries themselves, you're really just using them as aspect fodder. The only thing you really care about is the rares, because those are more common, and specifically the ancestral rares. And each one that you drop, you're looking through your inventory, you're like, okay, let's see, this one has a critical strike chance. That could be good. Oh, but it's got 2 other stats that I don't care about or whatever. Salvage. This one, okay, we got vulnerable damage, max energy, resource. Nah, doesn't have crit chance, crit damage, trash, right? That's the end game, right? That is literally the end game where you're looking through each piece of gear. You really remove that sort of dopamine hit that most people really look for in the RPGs due to this factor. Okay, you don't kill a boss and you drop a bunch of loot and you know, it's not like, oh, I know that's good. You sit there and you're like, okay, gotta pick up all my random trash. What stats are good, what stats are bad. The only dopamine hit that I really get in this game is when I'm enchanting and I hit the enchanted thing in like the first couple of tries, because after that, you know, the item's bricked, right? Or you can't use it anymore. So this ends up being a little bit less fun to run the same dungeon over and over again. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of things that kind of make other things that you might want to try really, really miserable. As I mentioned in a couple of points in this video, quality of life is sorely lacking. Trying to experiment with other builds is really difficult when you only have a few stash tabs to kind of sort through and keep various different things from the season or various different aspects you might want to use on other builds. Running through and trying to remove all your points from your Paragon tree to respec, not even from a gold cost perspective, but just from, you know, trying to experiment. Well, that's annoying because you have to individually click them all. It takes like a 10-15 minute process, right? There's just things like that, or even like the horse running around the map if you decided to do so, which kind of is removed from the game anyways. That's annoying. Basically everything that you wanted to do kind of has this a little bit of annoying factor to it, which really deteriorates the experience. But keep in mind that this is the end game, right? You've already invested, if you're a casual player, maybe 100, 150, maybe 200 hours, which most people aren't even at yet. So this is where we get to kind of the point, well, is Diablo 4, was it a good purchase? Was it a good game? And maybe it's a hot take, but I actually think it is. Now, obviously this is up for debate, but I've been playing Path of Exile recently, and I think I could sum up the difference between Path of Exile and Diablo 4 with, I guess you'd say, 2 words, and that is longevity versus, I guess you say, burst happiness, right? Diablo 4 has burst excitement, burst happiness. Why? Because in the early game, you actually have a really, really fun time. Everything, you feel like you're getting stronger, you're leveling up your core skills, you have so much things to explore, to do for the first time. That's actually really, really exciting. When you play Path of Exile, you launch the game, and to be honest, the mapping in the beginning levels is very, very boring. Your build kind of gets online, sort of, and you're just spamming out one skill oftentimes, right? And that's the experience for, let's say, the first 10, 15, 20 hours. In Diablo 4, it's not like that at all, really. You have kind of a synergistic build that you can roll out within your first couple of hours of playing, and you could have a lot of builds to choose from. There isn't like a one exceptionally better than the others, which, I mean, some classes do have like really good builds, but oftentimes in the early game, well, you have a couple of options per class. I've tried every class, and I feel like there's a couple options in every class, right? And when you reach the mid game, this is where Diablo 4 starts to become, I guess you could say, a little bit more repetitive. You have your build, you're getting your build online, you start to see a couple of the annoying factors. Whereas Path of Exile, a lot of the annoying factors that you might have had in the early game start to disappear. And in fact, you tend to have a lot of more enjoyment because your build starts to become online, similar to Diablo 4. So both of those kind of have that in common. But then when the real end game starts, that's where the differences really start to show. There's a lot of depth in the Path of Exile. There's a lot of options you have. There's a lot of really, really good builds, whereas Diablo 4 doesn't really have that. There's not really a ton of depth in the end game comparatively. The itemization is a little bit more boring. There's not a lot of, excitement in the end game. And of course, running through the Nightmare Dungeons is, I guess, in my opinion, less exciting than running the maps in Path of Exile, right? And the reason I use Path of Exile as a comparison to Diablo 4 because it's one of the most popular games that it's compared to, and a lot of the things that people basically tell you to go play over Diablo 4 because their end game is better. But most people aren't even at that point. And that's why I say I think it's still worth it. Because you have to remember that Path of Exile, in my opinion, has a cost associated with it. It's not as high as Diablo 4's. Diablo 4 does have that $60 price tag, and Path of Exile is more like $30, right? But in order to enjoy both of them, you kind of have to pay them out. The difference is in Path of Exile, you're going to get a lot of repeatable enjoyment. And maybe in Diablo 4, you're going to get the same thing in the future with additional seasons. But one thing's for sure is you're going to get a solid 100, 150 hours out of Diablo 4 for the price tag and enjoy those hours. And if you are that type of person that likes to play different classes, well, you're going to have that option as well. And I think that even adds more replayability onto Diablo 4's docket. One thing that's really, really important to remember about this, though, is that Diablo 4 is built for those casual players. It is built to kind of have that early enjoyable experience and then move on, right? Granted, we have seasons, and both games have seasons, in fact. And ideally, both games have that repetitive enjoyment, or I guess their replayability every 3 months or whenever a new PoE League season comes out. And if for Diablo, whenever a new season comes out. The big difference and the reason why we have such a negative connotation associated with the game right now is because, unfortunately, the game, in my opinion, got worse as of Season 1. And if the seasons start to look like this, where they start to remove a lot of the enjoyment factors that we had previously, well, then you're going to find that many people completely remove the replayability out of Diablo 4. And I think that's what the big problem is that people expected the game to get better. And so at the beginning of the game, people were like, yeah, it's solid. I'm excited to see Season 1. And now the game is trash. There's no reason to play it. It's garbage, which I don't think is true. And I also don't think it's the best game ever. But I do think that if you are interested in replaying the game thousands of hours, well, the game's probably not at that point. So if you're a more dedicated ARPG fan, then you'll probably want to wait until they've added something exciting to the new seasons. Maybe you want to give it a try and then come back later. For more casual players, I think if you're looking to kill monsters, you're looking for a very smooth gameplay experience. I do think that in general, Diablo 4 has kind of mastered that in a lot of situations, and the early game process is extremely fun. So I wouldn't be sad about purchasing the game and enjoying it for that reason. But that's just my thoughts. I know there's been a lot of negativity associated with the game, and as soon as you make a video that's somewhat positive about Diablo 4, well, you get bashed for it, and it usually doesn't do well. But I figured I'd give you my honest thoughts on Diablo 4, because I really don't think it's a trash game. I just think Season 1 is a pretty mediocre season, and if I were to rate the game in Season 1 versus, the launch of the game, I'd probably give Diablo 4 in the early game / launch maybe a 6.5, 7 out of 10, and then nowadays in Season 1, I might have given the game like a 5.5. Now, granted, that's due to me just playing the game more. So you could say, well, the early game is like a 7, 8 out of 10, and the end game is like a 4 out of 10 if you replay it a ton, and that's kind of where the game is at. So enjoy the early game, and for most people, it's not the early game because it's going to take a lot of time. And then when you get to the end game, well, you might start to see a lot of the, I guess you say, complaints where they show up. Doesn't mean that we should change the game to appeal to those necessarily. It also doesn't mean that we should ignore it. But I think those are just realities of the game. If anyone who's kind of reached these points kind of feels. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and I'll see you all for the next one.